So let's turn our attention now to our conversation for today. With regard to the protests and the demands of the protesters, we have here the Honorable Minister for Budget and Economic Planning, Honorable Atiku Bagudu. Welcome
Good
to.
afternoon.
It's nice to have you here. And we'll just set the ball rolling by asking you, because I don't think you've had any conversation since this began. What are your thoughts on the protests so far from your perspective as a government employee?
Thank you very much. And first, let me start by offering my sympathy to all those who have regrettably lost lives or otherwise were wounded or even lost property in the protest. And to also start by saying that we chose constitutional democracy, and constitutional democracy is based on, among others, the freedom to express opinion, no matter how different it is, but in a way that will not harm others, in a way that will stimulate discussion. And we are a nation bounded by a constitution which determines, in addition to that, the nature. So we have a federal setup that is constitution, which uh, created different levels of power in residing in the federal government, the states, and local government. And then, of course, that we are a constitutional democracy where representatives are elected, and even those in the executive are all elected. These are as of choice. Some countries have different forms of democracy, and in the Constitution, Chapter 2 specifically, we have our national aspirations, where we want to be, what we think should unify us. Equally, from the Constitution, we have drawn up different visions or national consensus as to where we want to be at any one point in time. And that's part of the national planning function. For example, we have an Agenda 2050, which was developed by private sector, public sector, civil society, organization, uh, uh, subnationals and nationals. It was chaired by Atido Peterside. And that Agenda 2050 give us a vision of where we want Nigeria to be by 2050 in terms of per capita income, in terms of our place in the world. And equally, Mr. President Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu campaigned on a renewed hope agenda, which reflects the Constitution and even elements of the Agenda 2050. And Mr. President, both from experience around the world and experience in Lagos, came to the view that the central challenge is that we have decades of underinvestment. We are not where we want to be in the world. We are not putting enough money in almost everything: security, infrastructure, human capital development, innovation. And why is this so? Well, rather than blame game to blame one administration or the past, it's just to take collective responsibility. And he summarized it that he inherited the asset and liabilities. And what is important in confronting the reality is what choices need to be taken so that Nigeria can be on the path to achieving those noble objectives that have been set forth in both the Constitution and in aspiration. So that's what guided the policy choices. And because we do not have enough revenue to fund our aspirations, what do we do? Do nothing? Mr. President and those of us in his team certainly felt no, we can't do nothing. What then the choices that are before us is to take measures that will convince investors and even creditors who have money, both domestic and international, that they can put in our economy. And while doing that, knowing that reforms sometimes have their lags, and sometimes they have consequences, and therefore ambition a whole lot of support mechanism to ensure that while the lags are taking time to yield the desired effect, we are not we have ways of supporting those who are vulnerable and otherwise affected by the reforms. And since it is a discourse, both before and after the election, people naturally have different views. But one of the unifying theme, for example, was when you take the issue of fuel subsidy. Before the election, all the major political parties campaigned on fuel subsidy should go. The Petroleum Industry Act that we inherited, that was passed and signed into law, had also made Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation a private liability company. The 2023 budget that we inherited did not make provision for subsidy. So even when Mr. President mentioned it, it was just in compliance with what the law has provided, and even the de facto reality that there's no provision for budget subsidy. For subsidy in the budget. And again, this comes at a time when many global headwinds, Russia-Ukraine war, other wars that are impacting on energy prices, we're importing inflation, interest rates are going up, flow of capital to most developing countries have been slower than what it has been. So, understandably, even in spite of the resilience of Nigerians, the challenges have caused some anger
in the land.
Well, not by a segment of society.
I mean, Honorable Minister, to stay on this point, because you've brought it up.
Yes.
One of the major things that has cooked this anger, even if you say it's among a segment of society, is this removal of fuel subsidy. You've explained it. Everyone understands this. Everyone campaigned on it. But we are also understanding why many governments before Tinubu's administration stayed away from it because of this level of suffering. And it is this level of suffering that has created the anger that we're seeing that have led to these protests. The cost of living has become unbearable for people as a result of these policies, grand as those policies may have been. Was this the right decision, considering that the buffers for the Nigerian people probably don't exist for many people? Was this the right decision to remove these subsidies when Nigerians do not have the buffers to survive the impact of that decision?
I think that's why maybe we have to be sympathetic to the president. Because like I said, even before he was sworn in, a law passed by our National Assembly in the way it has redefined the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation does not provide for subsidy. And the legislation he inherited, which is the 2023 budget, and consistent with what many people thought, including all political parties, like, look, sometimes we need to confront the hard truth. We want to be somewhere by a particular time, and therefore we have to take measures which may have some temporary pain, but which will eventually yield to. But in doing so, you are confronting many people. You are confronting the subsidy lobbies themselves, who have for years maybe benefited from this subsidy, so they can instigate a populace. Secondly, you linked it to food insecurity. The food challenge is not necessarily a function of the fuel subsidy removal. We have a war going on between the two largest exporters of agri produce in the world, Russia and Ukraine. fertilizer prices have gone up. We have lost traction about food production. We didn't quite recover from COVID. We had flooding that followed COVID. We had a transition year. We have currency redesign that even affects farmers' ability or producers' ability to find money and do farming. And the input challenge that despite a number of interventions to support the farming populace, but like I said, because there is a lag, so sometimes the benefit, especially as we know, when you plant, you need to wait for a harvest. And compounded by the fact that other West African countries are not taking similar measures that we are taking. So our food prices were even cheaper than the surrounding countries. So they buy from us, putting further pressure on us. So was that the right decision for the president take at the time he took it? Yes, I believe so. Can it be better? That's why I say it's not a monologue, it's a dialogue. Even if I take a measure that I believe is correct in a democracy, there could be need to interrogate further.
Okay.
And listen to others.
So let's stay with the issue of the fuel subsidy now. There are arguments back and forth as to whether the government is actually paying subsidy. Is the government paying subsidy or not on petrol?
Let's be very simplistic about it. You have a Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation, NNPC, PLC. The Petroleum Industry Act makes it a private liability company. But at the same time, it also mandated it with energy security. So only NNPC can say this is the price fuel, meaning PMS is arriving Nigeria at this is a, and if it is selling below that price, then obviously NNPC is either with their creditors or themselves, and I don't have the authority to talk to NNPC, taking a loss.
So is the government paying subsidy or not?
No, we don't. Like I said, we don't even have a budgetary provision
for fuel subsidy.
For fuel subsidy.
So where's last year it was reported that the government spent 3.6 trillion naira on subsidy.
Before we came, that illustrates to you the cost of subsidy. Between January to June,
when the budgetary provision was made.
Between January to June 2023, we inherited that level.
So from June 2023 till date, the government has not paid subsidy on petrol.
We didn't pay the budget. No, I'm coming so that I'm very clear. Certainly the budget, no, we didn't. The budget process did not anticipate, neither did we pay. But like I said to you, but NNPC, that is not to say NNPC is not suffering a loss as a result of the difference between landing cost
and what it's being sold at. So you're saying it's possible that NNPC themselves are the ones paying subsidy?
Maybe they are taking a cost, yeah.
As a private company, like you just mentioned.
Yes.
With the protesters saying that they want subsidy returned, is that something that the government could even think about?
Look, we are listening. We are not blind to the need of our society. But we are policymakers. We are, on the other hand, the president is a father, is a grandfather. He is listening. He is one who has given voice to the expression of opinion. We are interrogating and engaging so that we explain and listen. More importantly, listen. Is there ways we can do things differently? Can we calibrate better? We believe even those voices of reason who are participating in expression of opinion are also reasonable persons that can say, let us come to a conclusion that will be for the benefit of our country. I have seen one saying that, look, what we are even saying is, let all levels of government reform so that we do better.
Government policies should impact the poorest of persons, regardless of where they are. And we've heard people say that when there was fuel subsidy, and the claim that a lot of people were benefiting from it, a few people were benefiting from it, we were living better. And now you say that the government hasn't paid fuel subsidy from June till date. So how much money has the government saved from the removal of fuel subsidy from then till now? And where has that money gone?
That's the issue. If NNPC, that is supposed to contribute the most to the kitty, is saying to you that I can't contribute because I have to use the money to import fuel. No private company is importing fuel. It is only NNPC. NNPC is hamstrung because, not hamstrung, but it's obligated because they have to provide energy security. So consequently, what they can provide to the kitty will be affected by
the president's decision now, directive to the NNPC to sell crude to Dangote. Of what impact will it be to the country, especially with regard to importation of fuel?
I think that's a very, very important decision for which Mr. President deserves commendation, because what he's saying is we have always, as a country, provided 445,000 barrels for domestic refining, even when our refineries were not working. So this is sold and used to import fuel. Now you have a refinery and hopefully two others and smaller modular refineries. So Mr. President said, look, it's sensible. Let us give the crude oil to our domestic refiners who have invested, who are willing. It's not just Dangote. The policy is all our domestic refiners, so that they can refine it locally, add value to it, and pay for it in naira. That is the biggest statement of confidence in our naira.
Let's talk about cutting down the cost of governance now, because it's been questioned whether this administration understands the importance of cutting down the cost of governance, which has fueled the reactions in the public space, saying government officials still live as good. What has this government done to cut down the cost of governance that you could brag about as a minister?
I think the first thing is to even look at the conception of the renewed hope agenda, to look at the innovative programs that have been introduced, to even transit things from government financing. Then to also recognize, as I said earlier, that we are a constitutional democracy, that as part of that constitutional democracy, power is shared between local government, states, and federal. So you have in every year 774 budgets that are not controlled by the president, by the local governments. You have 36 other budgets by the states that are not controlled by the president. And then the federal budget. Mr. President have instructed us to even imagine that we are drawing water from dry well, just to underscore that this is where our nation is. We want the greatest amount of sacrifice. We want the greatest amount of innovation. We want consumer credit system to enable society to function without the need for much money, so that everyone's welfare can be. We want a mortgage system that can ensure that housing is available, so that public officials or not, they will have access to house that they don't need to pay for at a go. So these are all tools that are aimed at, among others, reducing the cost of governance, as well as President directing that foreign trips that are not funded by those who are inviting will be have to be approved by president, in order to ensure that he knows, because as a nation, again, we must engage with the world, but to show that expenditure control is paramount, he directed that he has to approve any foreign trip by a minister or a public official that involves the use of public resources. But that is not all. What the budget process itself is not a monologue. It's a process that involves citizens getting involved. Civil society I have interacted ahead of the 2024 budget session with a number of civil society.
Explain how citizens are involved in the budgeting process.
Town hall meetings.
Explain when you had a town hall meeting with
I can't
citizens.
remember the day, but the budget office at least conducted.
So because that is a major problem with Nigeria's budgeting process, transparency. We've seen budgets passed at the National Assembly without any public engagement. The amendments to the 2024 budget was passed within an hour.
That's what happened. Amendment is different from the budget itself.
But it is part of the budget.
No, sorry, allow me to answer the first question. The budget office, as part of the budget process, and it did conduct town hall meetings across the country. I met with a number of civil society organizations in my office. I don't have the list of the names, ahead of the budget office. And I met with institutions, other interested parties. It's even part of the mechanics of budget. We want to hear from, we don't have all the answers. We want to explain why we are suggesting a measure or a policy, and we want to hear perhaps somebody will have a better answer.
Do you know why this question around citizens' engagement is important? Is the concerns around who exactly is the federal government planning for, budgeting for? I don't know if you know the population of the country that you're budgeting for. Do you have a figure that you budget for?
I have the official figure.
What's the official figure of the population of Nigeria?
About 200. Yes, about 229 million people.
Well, that's an estimate,
I rely on estimate because the last census, I don't make up these figures. There are protocols in estimate. There are, first there was the last official census, and then there were extrapolations based on that census, and then there is assessments made by the National Population Commissions based on area enumeration, area demarcation.
So those are the figures that you use in your budget.
And that's regarded as dangerous, isn't it?
Well, that's the guidance, because that's the most officially reliable guidance that you can.
Okay, let's go to our colleagues in Lagos now. They have a question or two for you.
Well, thank you, Terry. Honorable Minister, just one or two questions. First of all, about the protests. How has government received the issues that have been raised by the protesters? When government called that the protest should be suspended, yet the people went ahead. What has been the stock-taking points for the federal government from your own perspective?
Well, thank you. First, as a government that believes in listening, I remember the president in his characteristic humility once saying, we don't have all the answers. So we have been monitoring carefully and listening as much as possible various agencies of government, but various public officials, to hear what is being said in addition to what we know, and what is the argument. And all that is being taken on board by us in appreciating what can be done differently. How can calibration, so how can public policy respond, or how can we engage further to ensure that we explain government policies? Still, we may not be able to achieve a consensus, but at least we will recognize it. Then, secondly, the government is saddened by the loss of lives and, of course, tragic participation in the protest by people who maybe their intentions were not to draw attention to issues of concern, but to loot the property of others or even cause harm to others. So we are not happy. But government is a constitutional democracy. We campaign as politicians, swear to defend the constitution. So we are on no doubt that the right to express views, the rights to an orderly procession to protest an issue is guaranteed by our constitution.
Okay.
And we thank our security agencies who have been directed by Mr. President to give the maximum support, and they did.
Well, just to be clear, I mean, some of the points raised include calling for the reversal of fuel price, perhaps in a way saying, according to the people, that subsidy should be restored, electricity tariff hikes should be reduced, and a number of other things that, probably would take a while and all of those things. In fact, we had a guest on one of our programs saying, look, if the president comes out today and says, we hereby reverse this, we hereby do this, the protests will stop immediately. Are those things in consideration by the federal government? So speak to us in those specifics, if indeed there is stock taking.
Mr. President has been monitoring, as he ought to, the situation very responsibly, very alertly. But I don't speak for him. I'm a minister. I also have responsibility. I have been monitoring these things. I have been noting everything so that I can also make an input. So I'm not aware of a decision yet, one way or the other. But the three elements you mentioned all relate to cost of living crisis. I'm just leaving an African caucus meeting where the finance ministers and central bank governors of Africa are meeting at the Transcorp Hilton. And the cost of living crisis is a crisis that is affecting many countries as we speak contemporaneously. So somebody may say there is a simple solution. Let Mr. President appear on the television and say, I have reversed this. Somebody will say, even if he does that, it doesn't solve the cost of living crisis. But what I can assure listeners and indeed Nigerians is that we don't take opinions lightly. We are not arrogating ourselves that we have all the answers. We will listen, no matter how committed or convinced we are of a policy, we also value the input of Nigerians.
Well, one of the things that the president, first of all, I believe that as minister, you also represent the president, because that's literally his eyes and ears in the Ministry of Budget and Economic Planning. Now, one of the statements that the president has made, severally too, is calling for governors to be inclusively engaged, particularly at the state levels. Now, there are those who believe that there are gaps in governance between the federal and state governments. As the one in charge of economic planning and budgets, what are those gaps, if you can identify them for us, between the federal government and state government in the area of governance? And how do you intend to close those gaps?
The starting point is that it's a constitutional issue. We are a federation. Most people make light of this. They don't know that this is as big, and we borrowed it from other countries. So meaning there are laws and powers that have been given to a state government that cannot be subsumed by the federal. So that is why we have the National Economic Council, for which my ministry provides the secretariat, so that we can, as much as possible, coordinate and speak to each other. And this comes up in many issues. The president does not direct any state. He doesn't have the authority to direct any state how to do their own budget. But he can encourage, he can call attention to let's spend money on this issue. And this is important. This coordinating mechanism is important because issues that affect the welfare of citizens can be impacted by local government spending, can be impacted by federal government spending, as well as by state government spending, as well as by federal government spending. But one recurring point, especially where I sit as Minister of both National Planning, or rather Economic Planning, that is managing or coordinating the national consensus that we want to be a greater nation versus where we are. We have limited revenues as well as our states. That is why Mr. President, in the measures he took, ensured that more revenue is going to the states, more revenue
Okay.
is going to the local government. He supported the recent decision by the Supreme Court that
Okay.
let local governments have as much financial autonomy as possible,
All right.
so that they will control their resources and also spend them. And what we do from the planning point of view is to engage with commissioners of budget and planning, and now maybe with the judgment to also find a way of engaging with some find an engagement mechanism that will ensure that all tiers of government are moving in a coordinated fashion.
All right, Honorable Minister. So let's look at the numbers now. The planned budget, 18 trillion, 18.32 trillion. That's the planned revenue. Total expenditure, 27.5 trillion naira. So, looking at the budgets and the previous budgets, from different administrations, we see budgets keep rising, in Nigeria. But when we look at the data, we see people are poorer, with over 60% multidimensionally, poor in Nigeria. So help us understand why we see budgets rising, but we still see that inequality gap, getting wider in Nigeria. Is it that we're spending on the wrong things?
Budget, the 2024 budget prior to this request for amendment is 28.7 trillion, with about 8 trillion of it being borrowed. When you convert it to dollar terms, it's about $20 billion. This is maybe our budget 20 years ago. That is part of our reality. We are not as wealthy as we think we are. We don't have the revenue. Brazil, a country with similar population like us, have a federal budget of nothing less than $700 billion. Do we want to be like Brazil? Can we compete with Brazil if what we are spending is $20 billion and Brazil is spending $700 billion? That's why we are not putting enough money in security. That's why we are not putting enough money in infrastructure. That's why we are not putting money in human capital development. And that's why we are not achieving our place of pride in the world. So when presidents say, look, let's have an honest discussion, I give you the metaphor of, or the simile of a head of household who is telling everyone, look, we are not as rich as we think we are. What are the choices that we need to make? Because once you start with that, and we all believe, then you can generate consensus. Because even to invest, to attract investors, the investors I want to attract want to know that I am responsible in the money I'm inviting them to put, and I can pay for it later. If I am borrowing, they will also see the same thing. So I have to make those choices. So in Naira terms, the budget might seem to be going up, but remind you, in 1999, the official figure, I'll come back to my friend again, of our population is 119 million. Our oil production in 1999, about 25 years ago, was 2.2. Now our population is almost 230 million. Our oil production is about under 1.5, 1.6. So what does that tell us? We are not where we want to be, because even as our population is growing, even the things we rely on to generate income has been declining. So we have to take bold measures that other countries have taken, or even in Nigeria that other governors have taken. Because President Asiwaju Bola Ahmed Tinubu, as Lagos State Governor, took some measures which we saw brought private capital into Lagos. things that can never have been done, Eco-Atlantic, could never have been done with government money. But now it's a new sprawling city because of imagination. We have seen how those who have been excluded, many people who live in Lagos before, they know the phenomena called area boys. When he came as governor, they were also, he recognized their humanity. They were employed, they were given, they feel proud of themselves. So that can be done at the national stage, and that is a renewed hope agenda.
I mean, not to take us backwards, but I still want to have a conversation about this NNPC. Could you tell us, have they paid any money into the Federation account since January?
I'm not aware.
No, that in many ways sounds like they haven't. Because if they had, you would know.
I know not necessarily. The Accountant General of the Federation will know, but I will be surprised if they have done so.
Why?
Because, like I said, let's face it, you told somebody to import oil, and he says, the cost at which I'm importing it is higher than the cost, is higher than what I'm recovering. You can interrogate those figures, you can debate it, but let us not again let us confront it.
Let's come back to the protests that are going on right now. There are reports that Nigeria loses about 50 billion daily because of the protests. Is there any truth to this figure? And how so?
I don't know, but you see, a loss of human life is one human life is cost enough that should be avoided.
Does the protest affect investor confidence in our country?
Oh, well, let us know that we are living in a global world. Everyone, even without protest, we are busy marketing our country as a destination. You and I will agree that Nigeria is a wonderful country. We are human people. Somebody does not know that. So any further issue that plays out in the media that can be misrepresented, why is it that when we travel because of the conduct of a few people, even given our population, but we are stereotyped? So certainly protest can affect judgment of investors, especially investors who have the choice as to different countries that they can go to.
Or possibly government policies, because we've been seeing divestments from Nigeria. Well, what's the government doing about that? Why are we having so many companies leaving the country? Is it government's policies?
No, we have to confront our decades of underinvestment. It's not a pleasant conversation. It's not a nice one. We also secondly need to appreciate that we are operating in a global world where companies have the ability. We have seen what is happening between the US and China, companies moving in and out. We are living consolidations, mergers, acquisitions. Companies, supply chains are daily being changed. So you are trying to compete within that reality. We are not an island into ourselves.
I'd like us to talk about the cost of governance. I'd be unfair to Parliament if I let you sit here and not ask you about how ministers are taking the calls for the cost of governance. I say that because every time the conversation about cutting down the cost of governance comes in, Nigerians point to Parliament and say they are heavily paid. And then the parliamentarians say, have you asked the ministers who move in with long convoys?
Have you asked them yesterday when they came here? They said,
have you asked them how much they earn?
How much you're spending?
Exactly. So I'd like to ask you as a minister, is it a concern for you that attention is being turned in your direction, that you are expending so much as ministers? Perhaps you could tell us what you earn, because a lawmaker here did same yesterday, and perhaps put this to rest once and for all.
Well, cost of governance is a worrisome thing, particularly me, because I I see the kitty, or rather, I see what is being and how the kitty is allocated. So I know that we are not in anywhere near where we want to be. So any saving from whatever quota is important. How are ministers compensated? Ministers, like every public officials, have a payment that is published, sorry, that is determined by the Revenue Mobilization, Allocation, and Fiscal Commission. Convoy. Sometimes the ministers, most of the ministers, I have one official vehicle. I don't even use it because I have a Camry that I enjoy driving, and as a minister of budget, I want to lead by example. But so in terms of how much is a minister paid by revenue mobilization, it's less than ₦1 million
A salary.
a salary.
How about allowances? Because that's the same thing we ask lawmakers.
I don't know of any defined allowance that a minister earns, but I might be wrong. But this is published and I can share it with you because it's determined by the revenue allocation and there's nothing additional to that for a minister.
You said you have one official car.
Yes.
It was given to you when you became minister.
Yes.
Was there an official car to that ministry before you were there?
Yes, there has been.
So what happened to the car before the one you were given?
I don't know.
So this talk about every time a new administration or a new appointment is done,
bring new things.
That new purchases
Like
have to be done. Just 1 second. How do you is that something that you buy into, or you think that it should be changed,
No.
as well as the number of vehicles in a minister's fleet? Because that's petrol you're using, and it's government that buys that.
Of course, I am for as minimal as possible. You see, we must start with the obligation that I chose to be a public officer. So whatever I am, or whoever I am, I should lead by example. And I should be minimal in whatever I can to show by example, to communicate sacrifice, so that particularly the younger ones will know that being a public official is sacrifice.
It's not supposed to be lucrative.
No, it's not.
Let me ask you a trick question. I don't know what you think about Parliament, the House of Representatives, agreeing to take 50% cut in salary as their own way of showing solidarity with Nigerians. Do you think that that's something that the ministers should consider? Remember that President Tinubu, Buhari did that with his vice president sometime in 2015.
That's why we have to celebrate small things in a democracy. Even if it is public pressure that is encouraging people to voluntarily say, hey, I got it. You think I can do more, I will do more. I think we are moving in the right. What is wrong is to be judgmental, because maybe we don't design the constitution. I don't design the constitution to produce 360 House of Reps member. I live with it because the same thing was 109. How they are compensated. Maybe we can do better. We can review the constitution. We can review the compensation structure. Some people will even say bicameral legislator is too much.
Yes, that's actually one of the demands. That brings us to what we're closing with. You keep saying about a dialogue. This is a conversation, not a monologue.
No, it's not.
So in this dialogue right now, where these protesters, they're Nigerians, even the people looting and the hoodlums and the miscreants, they are Nigerians as well. These are indicative of problems. You used to be a former governor, and you know, we've talked about this problem of so many young people who are out of school in northern Nigeria. Talk to us a little bit about what you think can be done about that situation as we continue this conversation about the way Nigerians are upset with their government.
I think it's basic, and it's in the scriptures. We have seen even prophets in both religions, Christianity in the Bible, in the Quran, the prophets, as blessed as they are, we hear stories and read about effort. there's no compensation for a life of putting on your effort. Society should reward effort, should give
Okay.
should give people who are putting effort support so that their effort matters. That is the ultimate economic reform. The renewed hope agenda is, among others, designed to put a macroeconomic framework where our younger ones can take on the world. Today, among other programs, we have youth-centric programs such that there is the National Youth Investment Fund. There is a 3 million technology training fund. There are other empowerment programs where youth, the whole idea of those is to ensure that if you are a youth, you can only be limited by your imagination. But you have to organize yourself. You have to take advantage of those opportunities. And it's the same thing even for the North.
Oh, hopefully the local government financial autonomy would help bring those policies closer to government.
Let's not presume. We don't. In the local government system, there are capacity issues. It is pressure that makes everyone to the tool, and maybe just like in a family.
I'm sorry, we're out of time. We're sorry about that. Honorable Minister for Budget and Economic Planning, Atiku Bagudu, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you.